I have learned that time behaves differently when you are close to the end of something. The last 6 months of my career stretched longer than the first 10 years combined. Every shift felt heavier, as if the badge itself knew it would soon be locked in a drawer and forgotten. 23 years with the Cedar Falls Police Department had reduced my life to habits. Same coffee at the same hour, same patrol routes, same quiet streets pretending nothing ever truly went wrong here. I was 58 years old and already half gone. My knees ached when the weather turned. My left shoulder still burned from an injury I never let fully heal. The younger officers treated me like furniture, reliable, worn, and easy to overlook. I didn't mind. Predictability had become a comfort. After Jennifer left, and David grew into a man who didn't need me anymore, routine was the only thing that stayed. I kept a countdown folded in my wallet. 183 days until retirement. I crossed off each morning in pen, careful not to rush the numbers, afraid that if I did, something would notice. I'd seen enough strange things in this job to respect quiet patterns. You don't tempt fate in a small town. You let it pass you by. Cedar Falls helped with that. Nothing ever changed. Maple trees shedding leaves, porch lights flicking on at dusk, radios crackling with noise complaints and stray dogs. People like Eleanor Henderson existed only as names on utility bills and voter rolls, faces you'd never really see unless something went wrong. That Tuesday night started the same as all the others. Cold air creeping in through the seams of the cruiser. Sarah Chen driving, tapping the wheel to a song barely audible through the static. I remember thinking, very clearly, that this was how I wanted it to end. No drama, no headlines, just one last slow glide into retirement. I didn't know then that my life was already splitting. That, somewhere, not far away, another version of me was moving through the dark, wearing my face, carrying my future toward me. Night patrol in Cedar Falls was less about action and more about listening to the town breathe. The streets emptied early, as if everyone agreed on an unspoken curfew. Storefronts went dark one by one, leaving their reflections stretched and warped across the asphalt. The radio murmured softly, a constant presence, like a pulse you stop noticing until it goes silent. Sarah drove slow, windows cracked just enough to let the cold in. She said it kept her alert. I didn't argue. I liked the cold. It reminded me I was still here, still solid. We rolled past familiar houses, same chipped fences, same sagging porches, same cars parked in the same places every night. I could have closed my eyes and known exactly where we were by the rhythm of the road. We talked about nothing important, department gossip, a rookie who froze on his first domestic call, the coffee at Mel's diner getting worse every year. These conversations were rituals, meant to keep darker thoughts at bay. Silence had a way of inviting memories you didn't ask for. I watched the town the way you watch an old photograph, searching for changes that never come. Cedar Falls wore calm like a disguise. I'd learned that over decades. Quiet towns didn't lack secrets. They just buried them deeper. People smiled here, they waved, and they locked their doors early. As we cruised Maple Street, my eyes drifted to the houses without thinking. Numbers blurred together. Names attached themselves automatically. Muscle memory. Training never really leaves you. It just settles into your bones. I remember noticing one house in particular, lights off, yard unkept, shadows pressed close to the siding. It registered as odd, then slipped away just as quickly. Time moved strangely that night. The dashboard clock seemed to hesitate between minutes. I caught myself checking it more than once, uneasy without knowing why. My reflection stared back at me from the window, older, tired, but familiar, reassuring. I didn't feel watched. I didn't feel threatened. That was the worst part. The town felt perfectly normal, wrapped in its quiet, as if it were holding its breath. And somewhere beneath that calm, something was aligning itself, waiting for the moment routine finally broke. The call came in without urgency, which is how the worst ones always start. A flat voice through the radio, clipped and procedural, cutting cleanly through our small talk. Unit 12, report of a 1014 in progress, possible attempted break-in, 1247 Maple Street. The dispatcher paused, then added the name like it was an afterthought. Resident, Eleanor Henderson. Sarah glanced at me, one eyebrow lifting. You know her? I shook my head. The name stirred nothing. Just another address. Another stranger whose life had brushed up against trouble. I told myself it would be quick. We'd roll up, scare someone off, take a statement, be back on patrol before the coffee got cold. That's how these calls usually ended. Still, something tightened in my chest as Sarah turned the cruiser around. The engine hummed lower, more focused. The radio went quiet except for the occasional burst of static. Outside, the town seemed to pull away from us, houses thinning, streetlights growing farther apart. Maple Street sat on the edge of Cedar Falls, where the sidewalks cracked and the trees leaned closer to the road. I watched the numbers pass, counting them down without realizing I was doing it. My hand rested on my belt, thumb brushing the worn leather near my holster. A habit, a comfort. The closer we got, the colder the air felt, seeping through the door seams, crawling up my spine. Probably a drunk, Sarah said, or a kid. Probably, I answered, though the word felt wrong in my mouth. As we turned onto Maple Street, the neighborhood seemed asleep in a way that felt unnatural. No porch lights, no TVs flickering behind curtains, just dark houses and long shadows stretching across the pavement. The cruiser's headlights carved narrow tunnels through the night, illuminating fallen leaves that skittered like living things. I felt a sudden, irrational certainty that this call mattered, that it was different. I couldn't explain it, only that the quiet had shifted, grown dense, expectant, like a room just before someone says your name. When 1247 came into view, Sarah eased off the gas. The house sat back from the road, lights off, windows black. Nothing moved. I remember thinking, very clearly, that if we turned around right then, something terrible would still happen. It was already in motion. Sarah reached for the radio to call our arrival, and somewhere in the dark ahead of us, my life began to come apart. We killed the headlights a house away and rolled in quiet. Gravel whispered under the tires as Sarah eased the cruiser to the curb. The night closed around us immediately, thick and soundless, like we'd stepped underwater. 1247 Maple sat ahead, a squat shape pressed into darkness, its windows blank, its yard choked with leaves that hadn't been raked in years. I stepped out first. The cold hit harder than before, sharp enough to sting my lungs. My boots sank slightly into damp ground as I moved along the side of the house, hand resting near my weapon without conscious thought. Training took over when instinct failed. Sarah circled wide. Flashlight off, eyes scanning for movement. That's when I heard it. A soft scrape. Careful, deliberate. I froze. The sound came again, metal against old wood, slow enough to avoid attention. Someone was working the kitchen window on the north side. I crept closer, keeping to the shadows. Every sense narrowed to that single point of sound. Years on the job had taught me the rhythm of break-ins, the impatience, the mistakes. This one was different. Whoever it was moved like they had all the time in the world. Sarah flashed her light without warning. The beam snapped on and pinned the figure mid-motion. Half his body was already through the window, one leg hooked inside, one foot still planted in the dirt. He didn't flinch, didn't curse or bolt. He just stopped, perfectly still, as if he'd been waiting for the light to find him. "Police!" Sarah called out. "Don't move!" He raised his hand slowly, fingers spread, palms forward. That's when I stepped into the light. The world lurched. The man at the window turned his head toward me, and I was staring into my own face. Same tired eyes, same lines carved by years of bad sleep and worse decisions. The scar above the left eyebrow, mine, caught the edge of the beam. Even the expression was familiar. Calm, resigned, almost relieved. For a moment, none of us spoke. The air felt tight, compressed, like it might crack if anyone moved too fast. "I surrender," he said quietly. My voice. He backed out of the window with practiced care, knees creaking the same way mine did, movements precise, controlled. He lay face down on the cold ground before I told him to, when I cuffed him. My hands shook so badly I was afraid Sarah would notice. As I pulled him to his feet, I saw the white scar across his palm, and something inside me understood, before my mind could catch up, that this wasn't a mistake. It was an arrival. The beam of Sarah's flashlight stayed fixed on him, harsh and unforgiving, stripping away shadow and doubt. I told myself there had to be an explanation, some trick of the light, some drunk resemblance amplified by adrenaline. I'd seen people who looked alike before. Doppelgangers weren't unheard of. But the longer I stared, the more that excuse collapsed. He looked exactly the way I did that night. Not younger, not older. The same sag under the eyes. The same faint crease at the corner of the mouth from a smile I rarely used anymore. Even the redness around the nose from the cold matched. When he breathed, his chest rose in the same uneven rhythm as mine, favoring the left side because of an old injury. Sarah shifted beside me. I could hear it in her voice when she spoke again. Uncertainty, creeping and unwelcome. "Sir, keep your hands where I can see them." "I am," he replied. My stomach dropped. The cadence, the slight rasp, the way he clipped the ends of his words. I'd heard that voice in interview rooms, in courtrooms, in my own head during sleepless nights. Hearing it come from another man's mouth felt obscene, like someone reading my private thoughts out loud. He turned his head slightly, just enough to look at me fully. His eyes widened, not in fear, but recognition. A flicker passed through them, something like relief mixed with exhaustion. "Marcus," he said. Sarah stiffened. "How do you know his name?" He swallowed, Adam's apple bobbing in a way I'd seen in the mirror 1,000 times. "Because it's mine." The night seemed to lean closer, sounds dulling, edges softening. I became aware of small details I shouldn't have noticed. The way his left eyebrow twitched when he was nervous. The faint scar along his jawline from a shaving accident years ago. Details no stranger could fake. I felt suddenly exposed, as if the light wasn't just on him, but on me too, peeling me open. A thought crept in, quiet and dangerous. What if he's telling the truth? "Badge number 4427, he continued calmly. "Detective Marcus Sullivan, Cedar Falls PD." Sarah looked at me now, really looked, searching for some sign this was a joke, a setup, anything. I had nothing to give her. My mouth had gone dry. My heart hammered so hard it blurred my vision. I realized then that the fear wasn't about him breaking into a house. It was about the possibility that I was standing outside my own life, staring at the man who had stepped into it. I gave the order out of habit, not conviction. "Turn around, hands behind your back." The words sounded distant, like they belonged to someone else. He didn't hesitate. No confusion, no protest. He turned slowly, deliberately, as if he'd been through this exact motion 100 times before, as if his body already knew the choreography. When I reached for the cuffs, he adjusted his stance to make it easier. That small, unconscious courtesy hit me harder than anything else. Criminals argue. They plead. They lay. This uncooperated the way a veteran cop does when he knows resistance is pointless. Cold metal closed around his wrists. I felt the click vibrate up my arms. My hands were steady again, but only because something inside me had gone numb. I guided him forward, fingers brushing his sleeve, and had the absurd thought that his jacket felt familiar. Same brand, same wear at the elbow. "Watch your head," I heard myself say as we moved him away from the window. "Always do," he replied. Sarah said nothing. Her silence pressed down on the scene, heavy and absolute. I could sense her eyes darting between us, trying to map what she was seeing onto something that made sense. It didn't. It wouldn't. I began the Miranda warning automatically, voice flat, professional, halfway through. He joined in, reciting each line a half-second before I did. Perfectly timed, perfectly inflected, not mocking, not showing off, just synchronized, like two tracks playing the same recording slightly out of phase. I stopped. He stopped too. "I know," he said quietly. "You don't like it when suspects talk." That did it. My throat tightened, breath catching sharp and sudden. That was something I'd said once, years ago, off the record, to a partner who'd since retired. Not in any report, not in any file. We walked him to the cruiser. Neighbors stayed hidden behind curtains, unaware that something impossible was happening on their street. As I opened the back door, he looked at me again, not pleading, not afraid, resigned. "You're doing your job," he said. "I would have done the same." I closed the door on him. The lock engaged with a solid, final sound. In that moment, I understood the truth I'd been avoiding since the flashlight came on. I hadn't just arrested a suspect. I had arrested certainty, and whatever came next would not be routine again. The booking room smelled like disinfectant and old paper, a scent so familiar it usually faded into the background. That night, it clung to everything. I sat across from him at the metal table while Sarah stood near the door, arms crossed, posture tight. The suspect, me, rested his cuffed hands calmly on the surface, eyes moving with quiet interest, as if he'd been here before, as if he belonged. "State your full name," I said, forcing my voice into something official. "Marcus James Sullivan," he answered without hesitation. I felt a dull pressure behind my eyes. Date of birth, March 15th, 1975. Each answer landed like a small blow. I kept going, clinging to procedure the way a drowning man clings to debris. Place of birth, social security number, previous address. He recited them all smoothly, accurately, with the same slight pause I used when recalling numbers from memory. Not rushed, not uncertain. Sarah shifted her weight. I could hear her breathing now. "Next of kin?" I asked. "My son, David Sullivan," he said. Then, after a beat, "You still keep the photo of him in your wallet, from his high school graduation." I slammed my pen down harder than I meant to. "That's not relevant." He nodded. "Sorry, habit." That word echoed in my head. Habit. As if this was all routine for him, too. We moved through the rest of the intake questions, and each response tightened the knot in my chest. He named my ex-wife, Jennifer, and spelled her maiden name correctly. He mentioned the apartment she moved into after the divorce, the one I never visited. He knew about the heart murmur my father had, the way my mother used to hum when she was nervous. None of it existed in public records. None of it should have been accessible to a stranger. I watched his face as he spoke, looking for cracks. Lies carry tells. I'd built a career on spotting them, but there was nothing. No strain, no hesitation, just familiarity, intimate and invasive. When I finally looked up, our eyes met. For a second, the room seemed to tilt. "You see?" he said softly. "This is why it couldn't be anyone else." I realized then that the horror wasn't in what he knew. It was in the growing certainty that he knew it because he had lived it. Fingerprinting was supposed to end it. That was the unspoken agreement between logic and fear, the promise that biology would step in and restore order. Faces could be altered, records could be stolen, memories could be rehearsed. But fingerprints were final, immutable, a man's last defense against impersonation. I told myself that as I guided him to the scanner. He pressed his right thumb to the glass without being asked, applied just enough pressure, rolled it slightly to the left, then the right. Perfect technique. The screen flashed green. I felt irritation spike through the dread. "Let me tell you how to do it," I snapped. He looked up, surprised, then embarrassed. "Right, sorry." The machine hummed as each finger was scanned. I watched the ridges appear on the monitor. Loops and whirls burned into my brain after decades in law enforcement. I knew my own prints well. Too well. There was a thin break in the pattern on the left index finger from a cut I got at 16. A scar that never quite faded. It appeared on the screen, exactly where it should be. My mouth went dry. The technician frowned, leaned closer, then glanced at me. "System's lagging," she said, more to herself than anyone else. She reran the scan. Same result. Again. Same. APHIS processed the data in silence. The weight stretched, unbearable. Sarah stood behind me now. I could feel her presence like pressure against my back. The result chimed softly. Match confirmed. Subject, Sullivan. Marcus J. Cedar Falls Police Department. The technician laughed once, sharp and nervous. "That's not funny," she muttered, fingers already moving to rerun the search, widening the parameters, checking for database corruption. Every attempt came back identical. No margin of error, no secondary profiles. Just me. Or him. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. In all my years, I'd testified that fingerprints were absolute truth. Now that truth was standing 10 feet away from me, cuffed to a bench, breathing at the same pace I was. "This can't happen," Sarah said quietly. But it had. I realized then that the evidence wasn't failing. Reality was. And once that line had been crossed, there was no procedure left to fall back on. Chief Morrison arrived just after midnight, his coat still half-buttoned, eyes sharp with irritation that quickly curdled into something else when he saw us standing side by side. He'd been woken up for false alarms before, for paperwork errors and drunk calls that didn't warrant his time. This wasn't one of those. The room seemed to shrink as he took it in, the suspect on the bench, cuffed and calm, and me, standing a few feet away, trying not to look at him. For a long moment, the chief said nothing. He walked a slow circle, boots echoing against the tile, stopping in front of the other Marcus. He leaned in close, studying his face the way you study a photo you don't trust. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured. He asked questions the way only Morrison could, short, precise, cutting straight through nonsense. Name, badge number, years of service. The suspect answered each one cleanly, even correcting the chief once about the year a precinct was renovated. I watched Morrison's jaw tighten. That detail hadn't been public. It wasn't even written down anywhere. It lived in the kind of institutional memory you earned by being there. "Stand up," Morrison ordered. The suspect rose. So did I. Without thinking. We caught ourselves and froze, mirroring each other in a way that sent a ripple of unease through the room. Morrison noticed. His eyes flicked between us, cataloging the symmetry. Height, build, the slight tilt of the head to favor a stiff shoulder. He asked me to remove my jacket. Then he asked the suspect to do the same. There was no difference. The scar above the eyebrow, the faded tattoo near the wrist I'd gotten in my 20s and always regretted. Even the way we both favored our right leg when standing too long. Morrison rubbed a hand over his face. "I've buried cops," he said quietly. "I've identified bodies that didn't look half this convincing." He ordered photos taken, side by side. Profile, close-up. Each flash felt invasive, like the room itself was trying to document something it didn't understand. When it was over, Morrison stepped back, eyes glassy, unsettled. "This isn't a prank," he said finally, "and it isn't a case." He looked at me then, not the suspect. Me. There was fear there, naked and unguarded. "This is a problem," he continued, "and whatever it is, it doesn't belong in the reports." I realized then that authority meant nothing here. Rank, experience, certainty. None of it applied. The paradox stood breathing in front of us, patient and undeniable. And for the first time in my career, my chief didn't know what to do. The DNA test was ordered like a formality, a gesture meant to calm everyone down. Even Morrison treated it that way at first, signing the request with a tight jaw and a muttered comment about clearing up the mess by morning. DNA was supposed to be definitive. Cold, mathematical. It didn't care about faces or memories or coincidences. It told the truth whether you liked it or not. I watched the evidence tech swab his cheek. Then mine. Cotton against skin. Same motion. Same faint wince of discomfort. The samples were sealed, labeled, and sent off like any other night's work. That was the lie we all clung to, that this was still work. Waiting was worse than knowing. The hours stretched thin, brittle. The suspect sat quietly and holding, reading an old magazine he found on the bench. I caught him humming under his breath at one point, a tune I recognized immediately, something my mother used to hum when she cooked. I left before he could notice me listening. When the results came back, Morrison called us all into the conference room. The air felt stale. Recycled too many times. The lab report lay on the table between us, face down, as if it might bite. No one reached for it. Finally, the chief flipped it over. He read it once, then again. Silence swallowed the room. Every genetic marker matched, every sequence aligned perfectly, down to anomalies so rare they'd been flagged in my medical records years ago. Not a partial match, not a statistical likelihood, a complete identity. I felt something hollow out in my chest. Identical twins could share DNA. Sure, but they couldn't share fingerprints. They couldn't share scars formed years apart. The impossible wasn't just confirmed. It was documented, signed, and stamped. Morrison exhaled slowly, like he was afraid the room might collapse if he moved too fast. "This stays in-house," he said. "No reports, no leaks. This doesn't exist." No one argued. I stared at the paper, my name printed there like a verdict. For most of my career, DNA had been the final nail. The thing you built cases around, the truth you trusted when everything else failed. Now it had erased the last safe distance between me and the thing sitting in our holding cell. Because if the DNA said he was me, then the question wasn't how he got here. It was why I was still free. I needed proof that I still existed where I remembered being. Something solid, something anchored in time. If the evidence said he was me, then the only defense left was the one thing evidence couldn't erase. Memory backed by record. My alibi. Sarah pulled the patrol logs without being asked. Timestamps, GPS data, body cam footage. The kind of digital trail that follows cops everywhere now. whether we want it to or not. We sat in the observation room, lights dimmed, watching ourselves from the night before, like strangers in a surveillance loop. There I was on screen, leaning against the cruiser outside Mel's diner. The clock in the corner read 10:41 p.m. I remembered that moment clearly, the taste of burnt coffee, the joke Sarah made about my handwriting on reports. At 10:47, the dispatcher's voice crackled through the audio. Same call, same address. The footage didn't lie. The GPS confirmed it. At the exact minute, someone was prying open Eleanor Henderson's kitchen window. I was 2.3 miles away, standing under flickering neon, complaining about my knees. There was no gap, no missing time, no chance I could have made it there and back. I felt a flicker of relief, sharp and fleeting. Then it curdled into something worse. Because the alibi didn't solve the problem, it multiplied it. If I was there, on camera, in uniform, witnessed by my partner and half the diner staff, then who had I arrested? Not a look-alike, not a fraud. The timeline itself had fractured, and I was standing in both pieces. Sarah leaned back, rubbing her temples. "This can't be happening," she said, voice low. "You can't be in two places at once." I wanted to agree. I wanted to cling to the comfort of impossibility. Instead, a memory surfaced uninvited, the suspect's calm, his lack of confusion, the way he'd known the answers before the questions were finished. He hadn't been surprised to see me. He'd been surprised but I didn't remember him. The realization settled like a weight in my gut. The alibi proved more than my innocence. It proved the universe had made room for another version of me without bothering to erase the first. And once that door was open, I understood with terrible clarity it wasn't going to close on its own. That night, after the paperwork stalled and the hallways emptied, I sat alone in my office with the lights off. The glass reflected my face back at me, faint and distorted, layered over the darkened room. For the first time in my life, I didn't trust what I saw. I raised my hand slowly, watched the reflection follow, and felt no reassurance from it. If the evidence said I was two men, then which one was real? The question burrowed in deep, gnawing and persistent. I ran through my memories the way I'd run through a case file, looking for inconsistencies. Childhood, academy, first arrest, marriage, divorce. Every moment felt intact, linear, solid, and yet another version of me carried those same memories with equal certainty. We couldn't both be mistakes. We couldn't both be copies. Unless the idea of an original didn't apply. I thought about all the decisions I'd made without thinking, jobs I stayed in because they were safe, risks I didn't take, words I swallowed because they might change everything. I'd always believed those choices defined me. Now I wondered if they'd simply narrowed me, shaving off other possible versions and leaving this one behind. I went down to Holding without telling anyone. He looked up when he heard my footsteps, eyes calm, almost sympathetic. "You're wondering if you're the real one," he said. I didn't answer. I couldn't. He leaned forward slightly, chains rattling. "I remember thinking the same thing, right before everything split." Split, the word echoed. Sharp and clean. "What if neither of us is the original?" he continued. "What if we're just continuations?" That broke something in me. The badge on my chest suddenly felt like a costume, my name like a label I'd borrowed. I'd spent my career believing identity was fixed. Name, prints, DNA, history. Now all of it felt provisional, subject to revision by forces I couldn't see. When I left him there, the station felt unfamiliar, like a place I'd visited but never truly belonged to. Walking out into the cold, I had the unsettling sense that the ground beneath me wasn't solid anymore. I was still breathing, Still thinking, still here. But for the first time. I couldn't say why this version of Marcus Sullivan deserved to be. The next fracture came quietly, disguised as routine. I was sitting at my desk, trying to anchor myself in paperwork, when Sarah dropped a printed call log in front of me. Her expression was careful, neutral in the way cops get when they're carrying something fragile. "Pulled your phone records," she said, just to rule things out. I nodded, already uneasy. I knew my night. I remembered it clearly. Patrol. Mel's Diner. The call to Maple Street. Memory was the last ground I trusted. I scanned the page without interest at first, until one line stopped me cold. Outgoing call. 11:03 p.m. Recipient, Jennifer Sullivan. Duration, 6 minutes. 12 seconds. My ex-wife. I stared at it, waiting for recognition that didn't come. "That's wrong," I said. The certainty in my voice surprised me. "I didn't call her." Sarah didn't argue. She just turned the page. There was a voicemail transcription attached. Jennifer had saved it. I listened alone. My voice filled the office, low and tired, softened in a way I hadn't used with her in years. I talked about regrets, about wondering how things might have turned out if I'd chosen differently. I apologized for things I didn't remember doing. I said David's name twice. At the end, I went quiet for a moment and whispered, "I don't think I'm supposed to be here." The call ended. I sat frozen, phone still pressed to my ear, heart hammering. The voice was undeniably mine, not an imitation, not close. Perfect. Even the pause before speaking, something I did when I was afraid of saying the wrong thing, was there. But I had no memory of making that call. At 11:03 p.m., I was in the cruiser. Sarah was with me. The radio chatter confirmed it. My hands had been on the dashboard. Not a phone. Yet the record existed. The call existed. The words existed. "You okay?" Sarah asked quietly. I nodded automatically, though my sense of self was unraveling. If my memory could be overwritten, duplicated, or split, then what else had already happened without me knowing? That was when I understood the danger. It wasn't just that another version of me existed. It was that he could act, choose, and speak as me, leaving behind evidence I would never remember creating. My life was no longer entirely mine, and I had no way of knowing how much of it had already been lived by someone else. The second call came before anyone had time to decide what to do about the first. Barely 24 hours had passed when dispatch crackled again, voice strained in a way I'd learned to recognize. Another attempted break-in, different address to address, same description. Male suspect, mid-50s, average build, graying hair. Looks like Detective Marcus Sullivan. I felt the blood drain from my face. I was standing in the station when the call came in. The original suspect was still in holding, asleep on the bench under fluorescent lights. I could see him through the glass as officers hurried past, their movements sharp with urgency. There was no way he could be out there. And yet, someone was. We pulled the surveillance footage within minutes. The image was grainy, washed in infrared, but clear enough. A man moved along the side of a house with practiced ease, checking windows, testing doors. The camera caught his face briefly as he glanced up. My face. A low murmur spread through the room. No one spoke my name, but I could feel it hanging in the air, heavy and accusatory. I wasn't a suspect, not officially, but I wasn't innocent either. Not anymore. "This is impossible," someone muttered. No one disagreed. I watched the footage again and again, searching for flaws. The way he walked, slight limp favoring the right leg, the habit of scanning corners before moving forward. All of it was mine. All of it had been learned over decades of police work. It was like watching training turn against itself. Sarah stood beside me, arms folded tight. "That's not you," she said. It sounded less like reassurance and more like a plea. But the evidence didn't care. The realization settled in, cold and sharp. There wasn't just one other me. There was at least one more. The situation wasn't contained. It was spreading. I glanced back toward Holding. The man on the bench hadn't moved. His chest rose and fell steadily. Peaceful. As if he knew something we didn't. As if he was waiting. For the first time since this began, fear gave way to something worse. Anticipation. Because if another version of me was out there, active and unseen, then the question wasn't whether this would escalate. It was how many times I would have to watch myself cross lines I didn't remember choosing. By morning, the station no longer felt like a place of order. It felt like a bunker. Phones rang and went unanswered. Doors stayed closed longer than usual. Conversations dropped to whispers that stopped entirely when I walked past. The second break-in had crossed a line no one wanted to acknowledge. We were no longer dealing with an anomaly. We were dealing with a pattern. Chief Morrison made the call before anyone could argue. The case was pulled out of normal rotation and sealed under internal review. No incident numbers. No digital trail beyond a locked server. Officers not directly involved were sent home early under the excuse of budget hours. The fewer eyes on this, the better. Detective Linda Hayes was brought in from Internal Affairs. She didn't ask questions at first. She observed, watched the footage, read the transcripts, compared the prints and photos in silence. When she finally looked at me, there was no suspicion in her eyes, only calculation. "This isn't impersonation," she said, "and it isn't identity theft." She didn't finish the thought. She didn't have to. Outside, agencies were contacted under vague language. Anomalous evidence. Jurisdictional uncertainty. No one said the words out loud. Not yet. But the shape of the problem was becoming impossible to ignore. Reports came in of minor inconsistencies, logs that didn't align, timestamps that overlapped, officers swearing they'd seen me in places I'd never been. I started documenting everything myself. A private notebook, times, locations, conversations. I didn't trust digital records anymore. I didn't trust memory. Writing became the only way to prove I had been somewhere. Someone. At a specific moment. Linda pulled me aside near the end of the shift. "Until we understand this," she said, "you're grounded. Desk only. No field work." It should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like confinement. As I sat back down at my desk, I realized the investigation had quietly shifted focus. It wasn't about catching whoever was doing this. It was about containing me. And as more people became involved, each bringing their own rules, their own fear, I understood the danger wasn't just the versions of myself still out there. It was what the authorities would decide to do once they accepted that I was no longer a single. Stable fact. Dr. Elizabeth Warren didn't look like someone who should have been anywhere near a police station. She wore a wool coat that smelled faintly of rain and carried herself with the distracted precision of someone whose mind was always somewhere else. When Chief Morrison introduced her as a physicist from the University of Iowa, I almost laughed. It felt like a bureaucratic joke taken too far. She asked to see everything. Not summaries, not conclusions. Everything. We sat in a small conference room while she reviewed the files. Fingerprints, DNA results, surveillance footage, call logs. She didn't react the way the rest of us had. No widening eyes, no disbelief. Just a slow, methodical attention. Like she was assembling a puzzle whose picture she already suspected. Finally, she folded her hands and looked directly at me. Not at the suspect. At me. "You're assuming this is a crime," she said. "That someone is impersonating you." "That's because someone is," Morrison replied sharply. Dr. Warren shook her head. No. Someone is being you. The room went quiet. She began talking about quantum mechanics in plain language, stripping away equations and theory until only the core idea remained. Reality wasn't singular, she explained. It branched. Constantly. Every meaningful decision created divergence, new outcomes, new paths, new versions of the same individual, each convinced they were the original. The many worlds interpretation, she said calmly. It's not fringe, it's one of the dominant explanations in modern physics. I felt a chill creep up my spine. You're saying I split, I said. That I duplicated. Not duplicated, she corrected. Continued. In parallel. She explained that under certain conditions, extreme energy, unstable fields, the boundaries between these parallel realities could weaken. When that happened, versions of the same person could intersect, occupy the same physical space. I thought of the other Marcus's certainty, his calm, his lack of surprise. If that's true, I said slowly, then he's not an intruder. Dr. Warren met my eyes. No, she said. He's you from a life where one decision went differently. The words settled heavily in the room, for the first time since this began. The chaos had a shape, and that shape looked disturbingly like me. Dr. Warren stood and began pacing slowly, as if movement helped her organize thoughts too large to stay still. She spoke with the careful patience of someone explaining something dangerous to people who weren't ready to hear it. According to her, every version of me had once shared the same starting point, same childhood, same academy graduation, same early years on the force. The split didn't happen all at once. It happened quietly, accumulating over time. Think of it like erosion, she said. Not one dramatic break, thousands of small ones. Each choice I'd made, or avoided, had carved a separate path. Staying with the department instead of transferring. Marrying Jennifer. Not leaving Cedar Falls when I'd had the chance. In other realities, I'd chosen differently. Those versions didn't vanish. They continued, fully formed, just out of reach. What you're experiencing, she continued, is convergence. The walls between these paths are thinning. She theorized that the energy released during the Henderson event had destabilized a localized region of space-time. Not enough to affect the world at large, but enough to pull parallel versions of the same individual toward one another. Like magnets finding alignment. Sarah folded her arms. Why him? She asked. Why Marcus? Dr. Warren didn't answer immediately. She looked at me instead, studying my face with unsettling intensity. Because he's at a crossroads, she said finally. Retirement, regret, identity. People who question their choices are more susceptible. Their realities are already flexible. The word made my skin crawl. She warned us that the process wasn't passive. The longer the convergence continued, the more bleed-through would occur. Memories, instincts, emotional responses. Each version would begin to feel the others, sometimes without knowing why. That's why the suspect knows things he shouldn't, she said. He remembers them, just not from this life. I thought about the phone call to Jennifer, the voice that sounded like mine because it was mine, just not from here. And it won't stop, Dr. Warren added quietly. Not on its own. I asked the question no one else would. What happens when they fully converge? Her hesitation was answer enough. In theory, she said, one consciousness might dominate, or they could collapse into something unstable. There's also the possibility of mutual annihilation. Silence filled the room. I realized then that this wasn't an investigation anymore. It was a countdown. Acceptance didn't arrive as a revelation. It came like fatigue, the kind that settles into your bones after you've fought too long against something that refuses to move. I sat there listening to Dr. Warren, watching the others process her words, and felt a strange calm begin to replace the fear. Not relief, just inevitability. If there were other versions of me, then I had already felt them. The call to Jennifer, the familiarity in the suspect's eyes, the instinctive certainty that he wasn't lying. Those moments hadn't been intrusions. They were echoes. I thought back over my life, searching for the moment where things might have split. There were too many candidates. The job offer I'd turned down in Chicago. The night I chose not to follow Jennifer when she asked me to leave Cedar Falls with her. The cases I let harden me instead of walking away. Each decision had felt final at the time. Now they felt provisional, like drafts of a life rather than the finished version. Dr. Warren was still talking about containment, about observation, but her voice faded behind my thoughts. I realized I wasn't angry at the other Marcus anymore. I wasn't even afraid of him. I was curious about the man I might have been if I'd been braver, or weaker, or simply tired sooner. When I finally spoke, the sound of my own voice surprised me with its steadiness. "He's not a suspect," I said. "He's evidence." Everyone turned toward me. "Evidence of what?" Morrison asked. "That this isn't a mistake," I replied. "It's a process." Saying it out loud changed something. The room felt different, less hostile. I understood then that denial had been the real danger. As long as I insisted this was impossible, it owned me. The moment I accepted it, I could at least face it standing up. I went back to holding later that night. The other Marcus looked up and smiled faintly, as if he'd been waiting for me to catch up. "You feel it now," he said. I nodded. For the first time. I didn't argue. I didn't demand answers. I didn't reach for procedure or proof. I simply sat across from him, studying the familiar lines of a life shaped by different choices. If the universe had decided I was more than one man, then fighting that truth wouldn't make me whole again. Understanding it might. And that, I realized, was the first real decision I'd made in a long time. The first new version didn't come in cuffs. He walked through the front doors of the station like he owned the place, coat unbuttoned, tie loose, eyes sharp in a way mine hadn't been for years. He introduced himself to the desk sergeant with my name, same as the others, but added a detail that made my stomach tighten. "Private investigator," he said. "Licensed, Chicago." I knew that voice, knew the confidence behind it. This Urkus had left the force, my force, 5 years earlier, in a reality where he'd chosen freedom over stability. His eyes held less fatigue, more hunger. He looked at me like you look at a road not taken, measuring distance and cost. "I wondered when this would happen," he said once we were alone. "Things have been bleeding through for weeks on my end." Before I could ask what that meant, the second arrival made himself known. 2 agents entered, suits too clean for Cedar Falls, movements economical and precise. One of them spoke my name before I had a chance to ask theirs. When he stepped into the light, I felt the room tilt again. FBI Special Agent Marcus Sullivan. This version stood straighter, harder. The hesitation I carried had been burned out of him by years of classified decisions and consequences I'd never faced. He didn't look surprised to see me. If anything, he looked relieved. "It's worse than we thought," he said quietly. "And it's localized." He explained that in his reality. The Bureau had been tracking small-scale anomalies tied to quantum field instability. Missing time, duplicate identities, overlapping events dismissed as clerical errors. Until now. "You're the epicenter," FBI Marcus said. "All of you are." The PI leaned against the wall, arms crossed, absorbing this with grim fascination. "Figures," he muttered. "We always were good at finding trouble." Standing between them, I felt something shift inside my head, an alignment. Subtle, but undeniable. Instincts surfaced that weren't mine alone. The PI's intuition, the agent's tactical clarity. They fit too easily. That terrified me more than their arrival, because it meant Dr. Warren had been right. The convergence wasn't slowing down. It was accelerating. The next two versions didn't announce themselves. They were found the way forgotten things are found, by accident. Through paperwork and chance encounters that only made sense in hindsight. FBI Marcus coordinated quietly, pulling threads from reports that had never mattered before. A vagrant picked up for trespassing near the rail yard. A construction worker hospitalized after a fall from scaffolding. Both had raised flags for the same reason. They looked like me. The drifter came in first. He smelled of gasoline, rain, and old sweat, wrapped in layers of clothing that didn't quite fit together. His beard was wild, his hair longer than mine had ever been, but his eyes were unmistakable. Tired, watchful, sharp beneath the grime. He didn't resist when they brought him in. He just stared at me with something like bitter amusement. "So this is the one who stayed," he said. "Figures." He told his story in fragments, leaving town after Jennifer left, burning bridges instead of repairing them, riding west until the money ran out and the nights got colder. He'd learned how to disappear, how to read people quickly, how to survive without trusting anyone, including himself. The construction worker arrived later that night, wheeled in on a gurney, arm in a sling. He'd spent decades doing honest work, building things instead of investigating them. His hands were thick with calluses, scarred in places mine never were. When he saw me, his eyes filled with something dangerously close to peace. "I'm not supposed to be here, am I?" he asked. Neither of them remembered the others, not fully, but they felt the pull, the sense of being drawn toward something unfinished. They described headaches, lost time, dreams filled with faces that felt familiar but wrong. The same symptoms I'd been experiencing, filtered through lives harsher or simpler than my own. Standing in the room with them, I felt the convergence deepen. Memories brushed against mine, sleeping under bridges, lifting steel beams at dawn, the ache of muscles used instead of minds. It was disorienting and intimate, like sharing blood. FBI Marcus confirmed the count. 6 of us now. 6 paths branching from the same origin. Collapsing inward. The station felt too small to hold us all. The air buzzed with tension, with possibility. I understood then that this wasn't about who we were anymore. It was about what would happen when the universe decided it had had enough of us being separate. It started subtly, the way serious things often do. A smell that didn't belong to the room, a sensation of weight in muscles I hadn't used. I was standing in the hallway outside holding, when a sudden ache flared in my lower back, sharp and familiar, like I'd been lifting something heavy all day. I hadn't, but someone else had. The memories didn't arrive like thoughts. They arrived like reflexes. I caught myself scanning exits I hadn't noticed before, fingers twitching with an instinct to check for threats that weren't there. A flash of asphalt under bare feet at night. The echo of wind inside an unfinished building. Hunger that wasn't mine, tightening my stomach. When I blinked, I was back in the station. Fluorescent lights buzzing, but the after images stayed. The others felt it too. The drifter pressed his palms to his temples, breathing hard. "I remember a badge," he muttered. "Feels like it belonged to someone else, but I know how it sits on my chest." The construction worker flinched when a door slammed, eyes darting as if expecting falling debris. He swore he could hear steel cables whining overhead. The PI laughed once, sharp and humorless, then stopped abruptly. "That's not my memory," he said. "That's yours. Interrogation room. Bad coffee. 2 a.m. FBI Marcus went rigid. "It's accelerating." That was the word Dr. Warren had used. Bleed through. The boundaries weren't thinning anymore. They were leaking. I could feel fragments sliding into place inside my head. Not gently, but with purpose. Skills surfaced without effort. Routes through the city I'd never driven. Names of men I'd never arrested. Codes I shouldn't have known. Worst of all were the emotions. Regret layered on regret. Satisfaction where I remembered none. A deep bone-level exhaustion that didn't come from one life, but many stacked on top of each other. I looked at the others and realized we were no longer fully separate. Our conversations overlapped. We finished each other's sentences without meaning to. Sometimes we all turned our heads at the same sound, anticipating it before it happened. Sleep became dangerous. Dreams tangled together, indistinguishable. I woke once convinced I was under an overpass in the rain, heart racing, hands numb, only to find myself in my office chair, badge digging into my ribs. The convergence had begun in earnest, and with every passing hour, it became harder to tell where my memories ended. And theirs began. The truth surfaced the way buried things often do, not all at once, but through pressure. FBI Marcus called us into a secured office and closed the door himself. No windows, no recording devices, just a metal table and the low hum of equipment behind the walls. He looked tired in a way that went beyond lack of sleep, like he'd been carrying this knowledge alone for too long. 6 months ago, he said, there was an incident at Fermilab. I knew the name. Of course. Everyone did. A landmark of American science, distant and abstract, safely removed from places like Cedar Falls. Whatever happened there hadn't made the news. That alone told me it mattered. He slid a folder across the table. Photos. Burned equipment. A containment chamber warped inward. Metal twisted like it had softened under extreme heat. Radiation readings annotated in red. One image showed a man in a lab coat standing too close to something bright enough to wash out half the frame. Dr. William Henderson, FBI Marcus said. Quantum field physicist, specialized in experimental energy lattices. The name hit harder than it should have. Eleanor Henderson, Maple Street. According to the file, Henderson had been attempting to manipulate quantum fields at a scale never approved for live testing. Not weapons, not power. Consciousness. The idea, dismissed publicly as fringe, was that awareness itself could act as a stabilizing variable in quantum systems. That thought could shape outcome. Something went wrong. There was an explosion, brief but intense, contained just enough to avoid catastrophe. Officially, it was labeled an electrical failure. Unofficially, it tore a hole in something no one had instruments to properly measure. The field didn't dissipate. It spread outward, thinning reality as it expanded. Localized distortions started showing up weeks later. FBI Marcus continued. Small towns, overlapping records. People reported being seen where they weren't. All dismissed, all buried. Until me. I stared at Henderson's photo, at the blur of light behind him, and felt the pieces align with sickening clarity. Maple Street wasn't random. Eleanor Henderson wasn't incidental. My life hadn't cracked on its own. It had been bent by something unleashed half a year ago, something still echoing outward, looking for anchors, and somehow, against all odds, it had found me. Dr. Warren took over where FBI Marcus stopped, her voice steady as she translated the impossible into something almost understandable. She described the quantum field Henderson had built as less like a machine and more like a wound, an area where probability no longer collapsed cleanly into a single outcome. Instead of one reality asserting itself, many lingered at once, overlapping and unstable. Henderson believed consciousness could anchor a result, she said, that a sufficiently complex mind could influence which version of reality became dominant. The field, she explained, was never meant to expand. It was designed to be contained, fed by enormous energy and precise calibration. But the explosion shattered those boundaries. The field began to radiate outward, weak at first, then strengthening as it encountered compatible conditions. Compatible how? I asked. She hesitated, then answered honestly. Psychological instability, people at decision points, individuals carrying unresolved conflict. People like me. The field didn't pull random matter through space. It aligned similar quantum signatures, parallel versions of the same person, drawing them together across realities. Where the resonance was strongest, the walls thinned. That's where convergence happened. That's why it's localized, she continued. It doesn't affect everyone, just specific individuals in specific places. I thought of Cedar Falls. Quiet, predictable. A place where nothing ever changed unless something forced it to. The perfect environment for subtle distortions to go unnoticed until they weren't subtle anymore. Dr. Warren warned that the field was self-reinforcing. Every convergence strengthened it, feeding it more data, more coherence. Memory bleed wasn't a side effect. It was the mechanism. Shared experiences acted like glue, binding versions together whether they wanted it or not. And if it isn't stopped? Sarah asked. Dr. Warren met her gaze. Then the field will resolve itself. How? I said. She didn't soften the answer. By collapsing all viable versions into one outcome, or by destroying them all. The room went silent. I understood then that the quantum field wasn't malfunctioning. It was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. And it was running out of time. The word collapse stopped feeling theoretical the moment Dr. Warren put a timeline to it. She didn't dress it up. She didn't hedge. She told us the way doctors tell families how long the machines can keep someone alive. A week, she said, maybe less. The convergence wasn't linear. It was exponential. Each new overlap accelerated the next, tightening the pull between versions until separation became impossible. The headaches I'd been fighting weren't stress, they were pressure. My thoughts no longer arrived in clean sequences. They crowded in, competing, stacking on top of each other until it felt like my skull was too small to hold them. I started losing time. Minutes vanished, then hours. I'd find myself standing in rooms without remembering how I'd gotten there, hands stained with coffee or ink or dirt I couldn't explain. Once, I caught my reflection in a darkened window and didn't recognize the expression on my face. It wasn't fear. It was anticipation. The others were deteriorating faster. The drifter stopped sleeping entirely, pacing like a caged animal, muttering names he couldn't place. The construction worker flinched at phantom sounds, muscles locking as if bracing for impact. Even FBI Marcus, disciplined, trained, admitted he was losing clarity. Thoughts bleeding in, he said. Tactical instincts that aren't mine. Dr. Warren monitored us constantly, scribbling notes she barely had time to review. She explained that once a critical threshold was reached, the field would force resolution, not gently, not fairly. Whatever remained afterward wouldn't be a man so much as an outcome. I asked her the question I'd been avoiding. Can we stop it? She looked past me, toward the unseen center of the problem. Not remotely, she said. The generators are still active. At Fermilab, the implication settled over us, heavy and unavoidable. If the field was going to be shut down, someone had to enter it. Someone already entangled enough to survive the approach. Someone the field had marked as compatible. I felt the pull then, stronger than ever, a gravity not just between worlds, but toward a single point, toward an ending. Whatever happened next wouldn't just decide which version of me lived. It would decide whether any of us did, and the clock was already running. The idea didn't come to us all at once. It surfaced in fragments, Shared glances, unfinished sentences that seemed to hang in the air longer than they should. We were sitting together in a secured room at the station, 6 versions of the same man, each worn down in different ways by the same approaching end. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it ever had before. Dr. Warren laid out the options with clinical detachment. Evacuation wouldn't help. Containment had already failed. If the field continued unchecked, it would collapse us involuntarily, violently, leaving behind something unstable or nothing at all. There was no protocol for this, no precedent, only theory. The field responds to coherence, she said. A single, unified consciousness has the best chance of surviving entry and shutting it down. I understood what she was saying before she finished. Unity wasn't just a goal. It was a requirement. FBI Marcus nodded slowly. If it happens on our terms, he said, we control the outcome. The PI let out a dry laugh. You mean we choose who disappears? No, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. We choose to stop being separate. Silence followed. Not resistance. Consideration. The drifter stared at the floor, jaw clenched, fighting something unseen. The construction worker flexed his injured hand, as if grounding himself in the present. Each of us had lived a life shaped by choices the others hadn't made. Giving that up felt like erasure. But the truth was harsher. We were already erasing each other. I thought about David, about the phone call I didn't remember making, about the creeping sense that my thoughts weren't entirely mine anymore. The convergence was stealing us piece by piece. Waiting would only make the loss uglier. If we do nothing, I said, we die confused. Or worse, we live broken. Dr. Warren confirmed it quietly. Voluntary convergence outside the field offered stability. Inside it, survival was a gamble. The chamber Henderson had built was still functional, dangerous, experimental, but capable. One by one, the others met my gaze. The drifter nodded first. I'm tired of running, he said. The construction worker followed. I just want it to end clean. The PI shrugged. Hell of a case, he muttered. Be a shame not to solve it. FBI Marcus straightened. Then we do it together. In that moment, the decision solidified. Not as sacrifice, but as resolve. If the universe demanded one of us remain, then it would get all of us. The chamber sat at the heart of Fermilab like a sealed confession. Steel walls curved inward, etched with symbols and calibration marks that meant nothing to me and everything to the people who built them. The air inside vibrated faintly, a pressure you felt more than heard, like standing too close to a high-voltage line. This was where Henderson believed thought could touch reality. This was where he'd been wrong, and almost right. We stood in a circle at the threshold, 6 shadows cast by the same body. Dr. Warren's voice came through the intercom, steady, but tight. She gave final instructions I barely heard. My attention was already slipping inward, drawn by something deeper than sound. When the chamber sealed, the hum intensified, lights flared, then dimmed. Cycling through colors that had no names, I felt the first impact, not as pain, but as expansion. My thoughts stretched outward, colliding with others that felt identical in shape but different in weight. Memories detonated. I was interrogating a suspect and sleeping under a bridge at the same time, filing federal reports while hauling concrete at dawn, running surveillance, running from myself. Each life slammed into the next, overlapping, folding, compressing. There was no sequence, just everything, everywhere, all at once. I lost track of which thoughts were mine. Voices spoke without mouths. Emotions arrived without context. Fear tangled with confidence. Regret fused with certainty. At one point, I felt myself dissolving completely, identity breaking apart into raw sensation. Then something changed. Instead of tearing me further, the collision began to organize, the memories aligned, stacking rather than scattering. Contradictions resolved themselves, not by erasing difference, but by accepting it. I understood then what Henderson had chased: coherence. Not sameness, but agreement. The others weren't disappearing. They were integrating. I felt their acceptance flow into me. The drifter's resilience, the worker's endurance, the PI's intuition, the agent's precision. Each choice, each failure, each survival instinct braided together into something denser, stronger. The chamber screamed as the field strained to adapt. For a moment, I thought it would tear us apart anyway. Instead, it yielded. When the noise finally dropped away, there was silence, not emptiness, unity. And I knew, without doubt, that I was no longer 6 men colliding. I was one consciousness that had survived becoming whole. I came back to myself slowly, like surfacing from deep water, lungs burning with the certainty that I had almost forgotten how to breathe. The chamber lights were dim, steady now, no longer pulsing in that impossible rhythm. My body felt heavier, denser, as if gravity had decided to claim me more firmly than before. I was alone. At least, that's how it looked. But alone wasn't the right word anymore. When I stood, I did not stumble. My balance was perfect, instinctively corrected by muscles that remembered scaffolding and long nights on concrete. When I looked around, my awareness expanded beyond habit, cataloging exits, structural weaknesses, electrical hums, training layered on training. Not competing, but cooperating. Memories settled into place like files returning to their proper drawers. Not fighting, not overlapping. Integrated. I could trace them now. Follow their origins without confusion. I remembered leaving the force. I remembered never leaving it. I remembered sleeping in my car and briefing a federal task force in the same breath. Each life was intact, preserved, no longer bleeding into the others. Dr. Warren's voice came faintly through the intercom. "Marcus?" I answered without hesitation. "I'm here." The sound of my own voice startled me. It was still mine, but steadier, deeper. Somehow, the uncertainty that had haunted every word for days was gone. In its place was alignment, purpose. I understood things without effort, not because I'd learned them, but because I had lived them. 6 paths, 1 destination. The choices that once defined me as limited now defined me as complete. When the chamber opened, the air felt different against my skin, like the world had adjusted itself to accommodate what I'd become. I caught my reflection in the polished steel wall and felt no fear, no confusion, just recognition. I was not a survivor of the convergence. I was its result, composite Marcus Sullivan, shaped by every life I could have lived, carrying their strengths, their failures, their truths, not an error, not an anomaly, an answer. And somewhere beyond these walls, I knew the field was still active, still unstable. It had drawn us together to resolve a question it could not answer on its own. Now it had what it wanted, and I was ready to finish what it started. Entering the field felt nothing like the chamber. There was no violent collision, no sensory overload. Instead, it was like stepping into a thought that hadn't finished forming. The air shimmered, thick with probabilities that refused to settle. Every step carried weight, not on my body, but on my awareness. I could feel the field responding to me, tightening, adjusting, recognizing something it hadn't encountered before. Dr. Henderson was still alive at the center of it. He stood near the generator array, face gaunt, eyes sunken, kept upright by systems he'd built to sustain himself long enough to witness the consequences of his work. When he saw me, his breath caught, not in fear, in awe. "It worked," he whispered. "You stabilized it." I didn't waste time arguing. I could see the problem clearly now. The generators feeding the field in recursive loops, amplifying convergence instead of releasing it. Henderson had built a mind-sized key and then been shocked when it tried to unlock everything at once. The shutdown sequence required precision. Timing mattered. The field resisted, surging as I approached the controls, pressing fragments of unrealized lives against my consciousness. For a moment, I saw versions of myself that had never converged. Men who had died early, who had chosen cruelty, who had never become cops at all. The field offered them like warnings. I held steady. I adjusted the phase alignment, drawing on the FBI agent's technical discipline, the PI's instinct for patterns, the worker's patience. When the final switch engaged, the generators screamed, metal vibrating under impossible strain. Then the hum dropped away. The field collapsed inward, not violently, but cleanly, folding back into itself like a breath released at last. Light drained from the air, pressure lifted. Silence followed. I stood alone in normal space, hands resting on dead machinery. Behind me, Henderson laughed softly, then went still, somewhere far away. The other realities slid back into their proper distances. The pull was gone. The question answered. The field was shut down, and for the first time since Maple Street, the universe stopped trying to decide who I was. The reset wasn't dramatic. There was no flash of light, no ripple through the sky. No moment where the world announced it had been corrected. It happened quietly, the way edits do, clean, precise, and irreversible. I felt it first as absence. A pressure I hadn't known was there simply vanished, leaving behind a hollow calm. When I stepped out of Fermilab, the night air felt ordinary again, cold, flat, unremarkable, too unremarkable. The pull was gone. The static in my head had settled into silence for the first time in weeks. My thoughts moved in a single direction. Phones began to ring. Dr. Warren checked her instruments, confusion giving way to disbelief. Readings normalized. Anomalies collapsed into background noise. The field was gone, and with it, every overlap it had sustained. One by one, the others slipped away, not dying, not dissolving, but returning, reverting, reclaiming their own timelines as if they'd never left them. I felt each departure like a door closing gently somewhere inside me. No pain, no tearing, just completion. Back in Cedar Falls, the consequences revealed themselves slowly, records updated without prompting. Files adjusted. Conversations shifted. Chief Morrison looked at me with polite confusion when I walked into the station. Like I was a familiar face he couldn't quite place. "Can I help you?" he asked. According to the system, Detective Marcus Sullivan had retired 6 months ago. Clean exit, small ceremony, gold watch. No incidents afterward, no Maple Street, no arrest, no paradox. The other Marcus had never existed here, and neither, in a way, had I. I went to my old house. Someone else lived there now. I stood across the street for a long time, watching lights turn on and off, feeling memories that no longer had permission to belong. Jennifer's name meant nothing to anyone but me. David had grown older in a life where I'd stepped away quietly, on schedule, as expected. The world hadn't broken. It had corrected itself by erasing the version of me that caused friction. But I remained, not because I belonged, but because I was created outside the reset. A remainder, a solved variable the equation no longer needed. As I walked away from the station, from the street, from the life that no longer recognized me. I understood the cost. The world was whole again, and it had healed by forgetting that I was ever part of the problem. I learned quickly how to live without leaving a shadow. When the world reset, it didn't reject me. It simply failed to account for me. No records, no expectations, no past pressing down from behind. I found work the way drifters and ghosts always have, quietly, by noticing what other people missed. I rented a small office above a closed insurance agency on the edge of town. No sign out front, just a phone number passed hand to hand. People who came to me weren't looking for justice in the official sense. They were looking for explanations. Missing time, faces seen twice, doors that locked themselves from the inside, stories no one else would write down. Between the cracks, there's room for truth. I used everything I carried with me. The discipline of a cop who knew procedure, the instincts of a PI who trusted patterns over paperwork, the patience of a man who'd built things with his hands, even the drifter's sense for danger, for when it was time to disappear. Each skill surfaced when needed, natural as breathing. At night, I wrote everything down, not reports, journals, dates, thoughts, memories that were fully mine now, anchored by ink. I didn't want to risk becoming unmoored again. Identity, I'd learned, survives by being witnessed. Sometimes I thought about the other lives, not with regret. Exactly. More like gratitude. They weren't lost. They were resolved. Each choice I'd made, and hadn't, had led here. To a version of myself capable of standing alone without needing validation from the world that shaped him. Cedar Falls carried on without noticing me. That was fine. I didn't need recognition. I needed purpose. When people asked what I did, I told them the truth in the simplest way possible. I handle cases that don't fit, and I meant it, because I didn't fit either. Not into records, not into timelines, not into neat explanations. I existed where things overlapped and logic thinned, where answers mattered more than comfort. The fingerprints had matched, the DNA had matched. The paradox was never resolved by choosing which Marcus was real. It was resolved by accepting that I was the sum of every choice and learning how to live in the space that answer left behind.